everybody, and welcome back to City Chats with Joyce. I'm Joyce Dooley, Director of Research and Innovation for Zpryme. I am super excited about our guest today. We have Zack Valdez joining us. He is the Department of Energy Chief of Staff. We're going to be talking about the race to zero carbon. So we're at a unique point in time where technology and need are converging to create zero carbon communities. And decarbonization and modernization are meeting to help us develop a cleaner world. But in order to assist these efforts, the Federal Department of Energy has put together unique programs and strategies to maximize this opportunity and help communities where they need it most. So with that, welcome, Zack. So happy to have you with us today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, anytime. It was so great talking with you at City of the Future in DC this year, and it's really great that we get to continue the conversation. Very much looking forward to what we have to cover. But before we get into all of the nitty-gritty details about zero carbon and what programs are available, I always like to ask this question to get to know our interviewees a lot better and just to kind of put perspective on why we do the work that we do. So, what makes you so passionate about what you do?
Yeah, so I grew up in Texas, oil and gas state initially, right? And didn't and going through undergrad, I got my engineering degree and really wanted to focus in on like energy systems. And so as I learned more about energy systems, I've had the opportunity to learn about different energy systems, oil and gas, renewable, biofuels was what my PhD research on. And one common theme throughout that was sort of looking at how it impacts people. And so I think through my time both in the academic career through a PhD, working on the Hill in the Senate Energy Natural Resources Committee, going through national nonprofits for equity and STEM education. It's always been the focus of the people, and I'm really excited right now to be at the Department of Energy to share that vision about people, about equity, about clean energy. And so this administration in particular really has sort of this initiative around Justice 40, where 40% of the benefits of the funding of certain funding investments have to go to disadvantaged communities. And so with that, we are asking a lot of the people who are asking for funding, what are your community benefits plans? How are you going to integrate the way that we are supporting your projects by making sure that that funding also sort of stays within the communities and the cities that you're working in. So not only are we trying to bring and deploy innovative technologies to really scale the efforts, but it's really looking at sort of a lot of that environmental justice aspect that sometimes gets washed under. And with all this like growth and infrastructure through bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funding, we're really looking at how do we reduce that energy burden. And so it comes back to that people aspect where it's looking at not only the technology, which is super cool and great, and I love it, but it's really looking at like how are we going to support the people and make sure that they're part of this movement to a net zero economy.
That's really fantastic. And so such critical work needs to be done. And I love that there's such an emphasis on equity and energy justice and really alleviating that burden that you're talking about, because traditionally a lot of people have been left behind or have been stuck, right, carrying the weight of maybe not as efficient or clean technologies or practices. And how do we make sure that those people are being supported and included and celebrated a little bit as we move forward into this new era of clean energy? And as you know, right, climate action is a part of many smart city visions, particularly reaching net zero carbon emissions. So, I know you touched on this a little bit, but what role does the federal government play in all of this?
Yeah, you had mentioned sort of your role as like research and innovation, and I will say that DOE cut its teeth in research and innovation, right? We have the
Mm,
national labs, we have basic energy sciences, we have the applied research groups. What I think is unique now in terms of DOE under bill and IRA funding is that we're really looking into that demonstration and deployment phase. So we have offices like the state community energy programs, where 25% of greenhouse gases are really in electricity and heating. And they're looking at the local level, at the state level, about how do we incorporate funding to directly support people to move towards an energy efficient future, right? So giving
mm.
them subsidies or tax credits or opportunities to reduce that energy burden and reduce that fossil fuel um, use and reliance. The other aspect is another office within sort of our Undersecretary for Infrastructure is the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And they're looking at like a larger industry perspective. So the other aspect of how the federal government plays a role is how do we incentivize heavy polluting industries like cement, steel, and glass to really
Mm,
think about ways that they can reduce those carbon emissions. And so they have, I think, almost $6 billion to help try and refocus
wow.
that. That doesn't include sort of how do we move into hydrogen and incorporate that infrastructure into our grid. And then within my office, the manufacturing and energy supply chain office, we are looking at sort of both greenhouse gas reductions, especially at the small to medium manufacturers. So making sure that they have an opportunity to cash in on a lot of the funding. But we're looking at things like how do we focus in on coal communities, those disadvantaged communities and the Justice 40 call outs, but also other technologies. So batteries and the opportunity for EVs. How do we um, build a domestic and resilient battery supply chain that's also mindful of environmental guidance and issues in that space here in the United States so that we're not having to rely on other countries or maybe free trade, not non-free trade partners to make sure that
Mm.
we have a very tight-knit supply chain that can withstand future crises, whether it be climate change or other aspects of it.
No, it's really important that you bring it up, and maybe this is something we can kind of touch on a little bit later. But I was at the South by Southwest conference in Austin the last week or so, and there were a couple of energy related tracks, which I thought was really fascinating. And they did definitely touch on the need for, bolstering American manufacturing and supply chain. And it was a really fantastic speech or presentation given by the Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm. And so, yeah, that was really important. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. In our previous conversation, you had mentioned a few other programs that communities and entrepreneurs could tap into. So on top of all that you just shared, which is a lot, can you share more about what those other programs look like?
Yeah, so I mean, especially for communities, whether you're a community organizer or a community group, or you're representing a city or state, all of the funding that we give out incorporates this, what we call this community benefits plan, which is up to a fifth or 20% of how we're weighting some of these applications or
Mm,
proposals. And so if you're a community member or you're involved in the community, it's letting those developers know or those technology groups know, like, you need us just as much as we need you. So forming those tight knit relationships that are sustainable, right? We don't want developers going in helicoptering in and saying like, yes, the city of Austin, like, we're going to be your buddy, and just sign something over. We want to see what that looks like long term. We also have things like state manufacturing leadership grants where we provide the funding to the state and then they allocate that out to identify ways to incorporate things like high performance computing and sensors into the manufacturing infrastructure that's already there. I think from like an entrepreneurial stage, some of that is in the R&D, which is
mm,
sort of the applied research. But if you've gotten through that pilot project, I think the next step would be for you to look at the opportunities for us in, particularly we're focused on manufacturing, right? So if you have like, if you're going to manufacturing a certain technology that's associated with clean energy, looking at that in a particularly in a coal community for billet 40209. Um,
mm.
and then there's block grants out there, but I think, one of the other things that we're looking at is how do we get entrepreneurs just aware that they can come through? Maybe it's RPE, so that's high risk, high reward funding as well through the Department of Energy. So it just depends on where you are on that commercialization stage, and we can direct you to funding that's allocated towards sort of that level of commercialization.
That's exciting and definitely necessary. And as startup founders and things like that are busy like trying to build their business and their technologies and find the proof of concept and stuff, it's not always easy to know exactly where to find funding and other opportunities to work with someone as important as the federal government or through the federal government to assist communities. So thank you for sharing that. I know that we talked a little bit about Justice 40 and energy justice. but how are we ensuring specifically that we aren't leaving rural and economically disadvantaged communities behind? If you could dive into that a little bit deeper, that would be awesome.
Yeah, and so I mentioned sort of at the start this idea that Justice 40. So 40% of our program funds are dedicated to disadvantaged communities. And there's a map on DOE for this energy justice dashboard. And I think that's a huge part of it, right? So this is dedicated funding that has to be leveraged in those areas, which is really important for us to sort of make sure that we're providing those equity opportunities.
Mm,
Some of those are based on socioeconomic status, but also could be rural and access to resources. So there's that aspect. But then making sure that we're providing things like, or we're considering things like tax credits and how
mm,
those opportunities for if you want your public utility is looking to purchase another energy efficient transformer. We have $10 million for that. And then there's, $1 billion to look at sort of how we improve rural or remote areas in the United States for reliability, safety, availability of energy and environmental protection from energy generation. Um, so I think there's multiple ways to sort of incorporate this and think about the larger United States and being sure that they are part of the energy transition. And I would say, it's just baked into what we're doing now. It's part of the administration's plan. And so we've been really just trying to execute on that and deploy in a timely manner.
yeah, no, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I mean, it's all about how do we get this built the right way, right? But in a timely fashion, as you're talking about, because there's so many critical points that need to be hit, whether that's from a climate change perspective or from a resiliency perspective as a country. So it's fantastic that there's so many opportunities for and programs that people can tap into and really participate. So energy justice is a little bit of a vague term, but it's really critical to what we're going to achieve moving forward. So, could you maybe dive in a little bit more about, energy justice as a topic and what that ultimately means?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I'm just going to start with sort of like a definition is it's the goal of achieving equity in both social and economic participation in the energy system, while remediating social, economic, and health burdens on those who may be disproportionately harmed by the energy system.
Mm,
So you could think of fence line communities in particular, or areas that may be adversely affected due to climate change, right? So
hmm
there are certain areas that unfortunately, whether it be hurricanes, wildfires, or what we're even seeing now in terms of California and all the atmospheric rivers that are pushing through there, we're really looking at supporting those people who may have been left out previously. And so I think part of that is helping develop resilient energy systems that
hmm
are clean, developing sort of that community input. So it's a as much as it can be like a small d democratic perspective on incorporating energy opportunities, working with minority business enterprises to make sure that they have equal hands in this opportunity, providing low cost capital and debt equity to those areas, um, but also just being mindful of where there might have been um, energy burden or environmental exposure for those areas. And I think
mm,
for me, it's really looking at like stakeholder engagement and finding ways to give those people a voice. So for our disadvantaged communities and the way that we sort of identify where the 40% of those investments go, it's really there's 36 indicators across climate and environmental hazards, and incorporating some of those socioeconomic vulnerabilities. So we're really trying to take as much of a holistic approach as possible, realizing that we're never going to be perfect, but this is a good starting ground for us to sort
Yeah.
of think about how we invest.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for diving into all of that. We're going to shift gears a little bit and get a little aspirational, I
Mhm.
suppose. So, what is your vision for the future over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I liked how you started this out about like the need for decarbonization and modernization. And
Mm,
so maybe modernization comes first as we think about how do we incorporate technology, chat Chat GPT is sort of taking over the world, right? And like, how do we
Right.
leverage that sort of technology, not
Mm,
only to find new innovative opportunities, to engage people, but also to find new pathways to zero carbon. And then thinking about ways that we can leverage that to promote a new workforce, right? When we're thinking about bringing in students to work towards a zero carbon economy, what kind of advanced technologies do they need to be aware of, whether it's quantum computing, artificial intelligence and machine learning, or even systems that are going to communicate these processes, 5G, Internet
yeah.
of Things, so that we can come to that zero carbon future quicker. So I think supporting some of those like well now in COVID, right? Like virtual versus physical interactions and making
Yeah.
sure that people can collaborate and communicate effectively. I really think that there's going to be a lot of space there. More than half of our staff at DOE right now is currently out of office. So like just finding ways that we can continue to do that and incorporate things that are involved in sort of the up and coming technologies through things like advanced manufacturing, robotics, digital twin, and as I mentioned, IoT. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And the last question that I have for you is that if you could change one thing in zero carbon initiatives, what would it be and why?
So I think that's like a tough question because I think there's so many opportunities out there, but it's just providing a voice, right? Working in the federal government, I realize that it can be a lot of work to navigate the system to identify
Mm,
how you um, are aware if you're a disadvantaged community, and then how you find um, energy or technology providers who are looking to build that sort of net zero goal with you. And so it's not only sort of reducing the barrier for engagement, but also making sure that there is not, as I mentioned earlier, sort of maybe exploitation is a tough word, but like just leveraging that opportunity to create that access, like making sure that is a sustainable relationship where everybody has an equal voice, and they're aware of what they're sort of signing up for. So whether that be more place-based solutions to carbon zero, right? It's going to be different for Portland, Oregon than it would be for Austin, Texas, or New York City. And so we
mm,
shouldn't think about um, we should just have a more open mind to what zero carbon looks like for different communities and let those communities decide it. And I think that's sort of what I would say is like, this is not a one size fits all, but we can find ways to incorporate resilient and clean energy across the country.
yeah, excellent. I don't think I could have said that better myself. Well, thank you so much, Zach. It was so great to have you on today. Looking forward to future conversations. Everybody else, thank you also for joining us. And stay tuned. We'll have a really cool episode coming up with Jesse Bounds, the director of the Mayor's Office of Innovation in the city of Houston, talking about all kinds of really cool things, smart cities. And with that, everyone have a great day.
Thank you.